Hi, everybody. Welcome to another day of practical creativity where we deconstruct, demystify, and unpack the creative process so that you can put it to work in your own life and business. I'm so thrilled and delighted to be here today with one of my favorite people, Talleri McRae. And she is so brilliant and such a heart-centered person. I'm impressed with you in so many ways, Talleri. So I'm just gonna kick it over to you and say tell us a little bit more about you and what you're up to right now.
First of all, thanks so much for having me, Marta. I am increasingly impressed with people who are finding creative ways to stay connected these days, and I appreciate the connection as well. So thank you for that. Tell me the verbs you just used about the creative process. Demystify, they were
Unpack. Yeah.
unpack, yeah.
And what was the third one? Deconstruct?
Deconstruct, yeah, those are great. So I'm a theater artist. I've studied theater for a couple decades, and I'm also an educator. So most of the time when school is in session, I'm a teaching artist, and I am visiting different classrooms, anywhere from pre-kindergarten all the way up through 12th grade and beyond, and using the art of theater as a catalyst and as a jumping point for all different kinds of creativity and learning. But one of the things I'm also super passionate about, it's not really an also, it's kind of an and, a yes and, is accessibility. I have a disability, I have cerebral palsy, and I grew up kind of figuring out accessibility in my own way with my family and my own teachers. And when I became a theater educator and a theater artist myself, I got really interested in how accessibility and the arts can kind of work together, not in a way that puts one against each other or kind of makes somebody choose, but a yes and how can the nuts and bolts of accessibility kind of fuel the creative process, right? And that's what I think about a lot as a theater educator and as a theater artist. And it's so interesting because a big piece of my time, whether or not I'm a teaching artist or I am working as an access consultant, which I also do, and as an accessible artist, I guess, is I kind of help people demystify, right, unpack and understand the processes of how you might make some things accessible. The good news is these days, most artists that I've met with and educators are really excited about making their work more accessible and more open to people, but they sometimes just aren't sure of what are the exact concrete tools, right? What do you do to actually make sure that your space is welcoming to people that haven't felt welcome there before? And sometimes it starts with something as simple as, what words do I use to show that I'm being really heartfelt, to show that I want to be respectful and inviting and encouraging for these artists, these audiences, these participants, these employees, fill in the blank, this anybody to kind of come and be part of this artistic process. So I'm all about kind of the practical tools, which I think we'll get to in a little bit today.
Yeah, absolutely. So you, for many years, obviously you studied theater, you studied education, you became a theater artist and a teaching artist, and accessibility has been on your mind naturally, a large portion of your life from personal experience, and helping other people help you navigate and helping other people navigate what they don't maybe understand or are thinking about because they may not have a disability. How did all these things start to play into your career? So you wear a lot of hats, right? So how did that come about, and how did you get comfortable with that? There's so many people now who are like, you have to do the one thing, right? There's a lot of pressure to be specific. So all of us, like you said, have these layers of identity. So tell us about you.
Oh gosh. Well, I was raised by two teachers, so the school teachery part feels almost like the most natural piece of it. But I have to say, growing up as a student that needed accommodations and needed support for my accessibility, and being the teacher and the adult that provides that are two really different experiences, right? And then also thinking about whenever I step into a classroom, I'm always thinking about the aesthetics of theater, right? How I am talking to young people, no matter what their age, about how you can create and tell stories in an interesting and theatrical way. For me, as I started studying, was the teacher side of my brain was studying accessibility and what it takes to make things accessible. I was so delightfully surprised that the creative side of my brain was also firing on overdrive, like, oh my goodness, I can put these two things together, right? And what might it look like if you have a theater production or a theater company that really embraces and uses a spirit of accessibility? So that journey, I started really studying theater companies that do this kind of radical inclusion. And there are so many awesome theaters around the country that are doing this work. I started studying that just about 10 years ago when I was writing a graduate thesis, because that's what graduate theses make you do. And then about a year and a half ago, almost 2 years ago, I met a performer named Mickey Rowe, who's an artist and an advocate who's on the autism spectrum. And I met him because he was playing Christopher Boone in The Curious Incident of the Dog in the Nighttime. And Mickey and I just got on the same wavelength so immediately about our experiences of being theater artists with disabilities, about our vision for the future, about how radical inclusion actually goes beyond disability and has to do with radical inclusion when it comes to racism, to sexism, to classism, to all of those other things, right? That if you're going to say you're accessible, that's a really big and brave and bold statement, but it also has to do with social justice, right? And the broader sense of things. So we were on the same page about that immediately. And Mickey, who is so brave, said, hey, Talleri, let's start a theater company. Let's get together as many different awesome, cool theater artists with disabilities that we know and start a company called National Disability Theater that will not only make really cool work, but will actually partner with existing theater companies around the country to show them those concrete steps and tools that it takes to make accessible work with artists with all different kinds of abilities. And I got really excited about that theatrically. And then the other piece of it that I'm excited to continue to develop as our company develops, as we grow, is this idea of how does a company like National Disability Theater provide professional development opportunities and training opportunities, both within the disability community and also for artists outside of the disability community that are looking for some of those tools that you were talking about earlier.
So what have you found in doing some of that work?
Oh gosh, it is so much fun. It is so much fun to work on a play where you get to celebrate all different kinds of movement, right? Where in a typical non-disabled space, right, in non-disabled culture, you're kind of not sure what to do with, let's say, a wheelchair, right? We're not kind of sure what the etiquette is. We're not sure how to do it. Many of us have been raised that it's kind of polite not to really engage or notice or speak about it. And in disability culture, we're like, let's bring in more. Let's do that. Let's see if we can turn. Let's switch in and out, right? So like, just having a chance to play with some of the cultural pieces, whether that's our gear or the language that we use or the way that we talk about each other or to each other, and just to get in the room with a bunch of other theater artists with disabilities is something that I had never done before, right? Usually I was kind of the only one in the room. So to have that sense of community and artistry all together was super awesome. Is super awesome. I say was because we did have our first partnership was with La Jolla Playhouse this past winter. We worked on their 2020 performance outreach tour or pop tour. So we got to partner with them and create a really amazing show with a stable of disabled artists, which was great. The other piece of it, that inaugural project that I kind of knew, but for me in my career, I kind of know things and then learn them over and over again, is that this work is really hard. And it's a lot about trial and error, right? And it's a lot about having to celebrate those failures and be really kind to yourself and forgiving to yourself and acknowledging kind of where you are in the process, which is really hard when you're trying to make beautiful art and work on a timeline in a schedule. When you're working with collaborators that you don't want to let down. when there's that little piece of me as an artist that has that ego that says, I want people to think I'm really good and good at what I'm doing. And part of what I have to show in accessibility and that I'm good at I'm doing is that I'm comfortable saying, I don't know. Gosh, that's a really tricky problem. I'm not sure. I'm not sure when we can figure that out.
Right.
And that is really tricky when you put that up again, when you put that kind of philosophy up against those very real deadlines that happen in the world.
Well, making artwork is never linear, right? We've been talking, just the past couple of people we've had on have talked a lot about kind of their process. So do you mind digging in a little bit more as to what that looks like when you're working with a group of disabled artists or artists who maybe don't have disabilities or a mixed group, and what that kind of means? Because there's a whole lot of, difference there. Like, how do you make it safe for people to explore and get past that? Okay, let's just,
Yeah.
be polite or whatever, like you were saying before.
Yeah. Part of some of the ground rules that we found really helpful in our artistic process, our most recent one with La Jolla Playhouse, was just really borrowing from some mantras of disability culture, right? One is that we believe really strongly in interdependence, that we can do really good work together, right? Which again is something we all talk about, but it's really, really true. And someone's having a bad day and can't make the meeting or isn't able to sign on to the technology in the way that they were hoping they could, and like being really, really radically forgiving with that kind of interdependence was important. The other thing that was really important was the idea about nothing about us without us, right? So if we are going to create a story, the story we told had a lot to do with wheelchair culture. We had 2 characters in our play that used wheelchairs. And at one point, we were developing the script, and everybody in one specific meeting that we had, we were all giving feedback to each other, and we realized on the phone that nobody on the phone used a wheelchair. And we were like, okay, great, no problem. We had people in our community that we could bring in. So we had to kind of change the process a little bit. In a standard professional process, the directors and the writers and the dramaturgs do a little bit of work, and then you bring on the design team a little bit later. Well, we had an amazing costume designer, Mallory K. Nelson, who uses a wheelchair part-time, just like our main character. And we were like, great, no problem. We're going to bring Mal in earlier in this design process, which was richer for everybody, right? For her design, for our conversations, for all of that. So it's just about, again, like being really flexible. So there's that. The third piece of disability culture that's really helpful is this idea that we really borrowed from deaf culture, which is disability gain, right? So that comes from deaf culture and deaf gain, right? What do you gain from having access to that different culture? And so we tried so hard for ourselves when we were kind of in rooms by ourselves to remind ourselves that what we were doing was celebrating and being really excited about and lifting up the cool parts about being part of disabled culture, about having disabilities, the ingenuity, the creativity, the adaptation, all of those things that come with that. So we did that internally. And then we also really tried to push that outward as well, so that when we were flipping the process on its head, when things were changing, when it was really unpredictable, we could hopefully keep our collaborators, and oh my gosh, La Jolla Playhouse was so game for this. We could keep our collaborators really excited about that, the kind of gains that we were getting from that process as well. There's 3 other kind of practical things that I bring into any situation as a teacher or any environment that I'm trying to make accessible. And I have really drilled these down from the idea of universal design. So universal design started as an architectural idea that you can create spaces, physical spaces, that are accessible to most people at all times, right? As many people as possible is what universal design says. There also is a set of principles for universal design for learning, right? Which is a space where you want people to learn things. So for me, that's a classroom, that's rehearsal, that's consulting, right? That's a really broad thing. So cast.org, C-A-S-T.org, has a great breakdown of universal design. But I think about universal design coming down to three things, which is when you're presenting someone with new information, are you giving them choices, right? Do they have options for how they are going to interact with that information? Sometimes it's as simple as sending an attachment in an email and making sure there's a couple different formatting choices for how people engage with that information. Sometimes it's a matter of saying, have I provided a visual as well as speaking about it? So choices is the first one. The second one that I think is really helpful is communication. Communicating in advance what to expect. Communicating about things that sometimes in our typical processes we don't think about communicating, because we just think, well, everybody knows that the meeting starts with this community chant that we do, right? Well, there could be people new to the community that don't know that. And in a theater process too, the idea of like, well, everybody knows that the director and the dramaturg and the writers work on the play first and then the designers come in later. Okay, well, let's talk about that and see, does that work for us? Does that fit for us? So it's like kind of peeling back all the implied communication that is in a situation and doing that. So there's communication, there's choices, and then there's creativity, right? Which is where you say, okay, we've communicated in advance. We've tried to be as transparent as possible about what we expect from everybody along the way. And then inevitably, no matter how well you plan, there's that in the moment, unexpected, okay, we've got a problem to solve. How do we do this? And what's interesting about the work that NDT has done so far, and also information that I have heard from other radically inclusive theater companies, is, you know, the more people from the disability community that you put in a certain space, then the more you're adjusting the expectations, right? The more that you've got to make adjustments, because the non-disabled world doesn't work for many of us. So you've got to make those accommodations. So the more you put in, the more creativity you throw in there, the more unexpected things could possibly happen, right? So it's like layering on layering on layering. And then also, the more chances are that you're going to have two accommodations that butt up against each other, where one person says, here's what I need to be successful, and the other person says, if you get that, then I have a chance of being less successful, right? One example I heard of this is that there was a bilingual production that was in English and sign language that was happening, and one of the hearing artists that was in that show got migraines when they looked at sign language. Like they couldn't quite figure out all the details of it, but it was like, I'm having a really hard time being at rehearsals. And so they had to navigate, like, okay, this is a bilingual play. It's gonna have sign language in it.
Right.
So how do we make that work, right? And so part of it is just knowing that those are gonna come up, being comfortable with that discomfort, and then just, you know, as my friend Reagan Linton says, Reagan runs a theater company in Denver called Family Theater. And she says, that's where you just love everybody through it. You just have to love your way through it.
Amazing. Well, those three things from disability culture, super helpful. The three ground rules to have in mind, those are amazing. Thank you. That's really concrete. And I think part of why when people start talking about wanting to be accessible and then actually taking steps to be accessible, there's a bit of a gap there. And I think people mean well, but they don't necessarily want to admit they don't know how to get started, and they're a little bit embarrassed that they think they should know, but they don't. So how do you work with people, or what would you recommend to get started? Is this like, we're going to look at all the possible access points? Do we need a consultant? Do we need to look at our website? Like, where do you, like, when you really think about what is accessible, it can also be like, oh my gosh, everything needs to be changed, right?
Yeah.
So how do you help people start?
First, I would say take a deep breath because it can feel really overwhelming. And I think it helps to sometimes have a really specific goal. Some of the organizations that I've worked with as a consultant have had a really specific goal. So they've said, we have a performance like the curious incident of the dog in the nighttime, and we would like to make sure that the local adult autistic community feels welcome and invited. That's a really specific goal, right? Another organization I worked with a couple of years ago said, we have a large blind population in our city. We would love to have a working group with some blind arts patrons to get more information about what is and is not accessible about their arts experience. That's really concrete. And when you start with those specifics, you're going to open up into some of those more general rules for how to do that. The other thing that's really helpful about having a specific goal, and hopefully a specific audience or collaborator, I should say, in mind, because we often think about accessibility in terms of our audiences, but I think we are at a point where we can stretch ourselves even further, right, and think about all of the collaborators that we have, that we work with. So when you're thinking about that kind of collaborator, if you have a specific subculture or community within the disability community in mind, that gives you a little bit more of a resource to reach out, right? With Nothing About Us Without Us, I always encourage my clients to go find somebody in their local community that is an adult that has lived experience with disability, that can be an ally for them, that can be a resource for them, and that is willing to help them in that way. And then you can access some more general resources for general pieces of accessibility, but it's always a conversation between those general guidelines that you have, which are never going to get you all the way there, and the individual relationships that you're building with the collaborators that you want to bring on board. There's always a dialogue between those two things. And it's a push-pull. I never feel like I'm in balance with that. I feel like I'm kind of over on one side and then I pull myself over on the other, and it ends up being balanced somehow, but I always feel like I'm kind of tipping in one direction or the other between what do I know in general about best practices and how am I making a relationship with this specific collaborator.
I love that you said that, because really when it comes down to it, when we think about accessibility, it can seem like very big and abstract. But what you're really saying is it's about people, and you can reach out to people to help you. So if you don't have a special relationship with a particular population, but you're looking to engage them, the first step is find a human being who, can help you, right? And that whole nothing about us without us, bringing in that person automatically helps you see your own inability, what do you call them, blind spots, right? Yeah. So you're actually bringing somebody in who can help you because of their lived experience. Again, it becomes more like this is about people with people, not trying to do something in the abstract for abstract purposes or situations or potential occurrences, right? So I love that, because it's about people. So bringing in people makes it work, right?
One of my favorite stories about an organization that did this really well is from several years ago when Sesame Street was introducing the character of Julia on Sesame Street, who is autistic, who has autism. Now, it's a little bit tricky because in the last 2 years or so, the Autistic Self-Advocacy Network and Sesame Street have parted ways, because Sesame Street was endorsing some resources that the Autism Self-Advocacy Network didn't feel comfortable with. But early on, when their collaboration was really strong, Sesame Street did 3 things. They checked in with adults who had lived experience with autism, which I thought was great. They checked in with parents and teachers who taught young people with autism, which is important, particularly not because you need to know how kids respond to everything. I think sometimes with disability, we assume that we need to know how things work with kids, but people with disabilities grow up to be adults. But because Sesame Street's audience is young kids, I think that that was an important piece there. And then the third piece that they checked in with were professionals and service providers that worked with autistic communities. But
Mm.
what I loved about that triangle, there's something really, again, in balance about a triangle, right? With all three of those pieces. What I loved about that triangle was that Sesame Street tried their best not to weight any one perspective more than the other. So one area that they had completely conflicting advice on from the two groups was language, which is always a hard thing with accessibility, right? The adults from the self advocacy network, which is ASAN, they said, we like the phrase autistic. I am autistic. It's part of who I am. It's my identity, and I'm proud of it. I'm not going to hide it. I'm not going to be ashamed of it. And parents of young kids with autism said, please say child with autism. Please say student with autism. Please say person with autism. And the deeper both sides got, the more impassioned it got. So Sesame Street literally counted its words. And they were like, great, when we talk about Julia, we're going to talk about how she's autistic, and we're going to talk about how she has autism. We are going to talk about how, and they literally counted in that opening episode where Abby introduces Julia to Big Bird. They literally counted and made sure that they balanced out that language so that both audiences felt really heard, right, in that way, which I thought was just a great example that you're not going to get, the more people you bring in, you're not going to get consensus, but you are going to have such a rich amount of experience to pull from.
I think you're hitting on something that is something I'm experiencing with another client right now, which is specifically when you bring in multiple viewpoints, and because you, again, like disability game, just like diversity game, anyone who is not the same as anybody else is going to have something else to bring. But I think our culture tends to prefer consensus. So there's potential for anxiety and not feeling like you're okay, or you know what's going on, or that you have control of yourself or the situation. But I think one of the best things that could happen out of this is to help people understand that complete consensus, when you are bringing in so many viewpoints, may not be the goal. Like, how do we have these conversations, and how do we get used to knowing and showing and bringing people in around complicated questions, because they're about personal preference and they're about people's experience, which really matters. And you can't assume anything about anybody else's experience. But complete consensus may be a thing of the past at a certain point, because we have such benefit of now people like you, and just the world is opening up. Look at how we're all connected, right? And we're learning that sometimes our experience isn't the most important experience. We are in a place that is like new frontiers for even what we can accomplish together. But it's definitely not going to be like everyone's on the same page, and those who don't agree don't say anything. But I think navigating those conversations and being able to help people feel safe to express and safe to hear, right? Viewpoints that may not be familiar to them.
Yeah, it makes me think of two, again, kind of concrete things. One is, I find the more viewpoints you bring in, that's where that advanced communication is really helpful, right? So saying, I am really excited to get your perspective on X because I'm working on Y, right? And also say, and I'm also looking at lots of other viewpoints as I put together Y, so that people know, and it's not a trick or a surprise that you're getting those multiple points of view. The other piece I think is always a challenge for me is figuring out how to weight those different perspectives based on the situation. So for our production with La Jolla Playhouse, their pop tour had a character in it who had a disability and was also trans. And so we made a decision as the artistic team. We're like, we have plenty of people with disabilities on the artistic team. We had 2 directors, 2 writers, a set designer, a costume designer, and a sound designer with disabilities. We were like, great, we would love to find a performer who is trans and disabled But if not, the perspective in the room that we are lacking, we had a couple folks that identified as non-binary, but the perspective we were lacking in the room more than disability was that trans perspective, right? So we had to have a conversation as a group and say, we would love to get another person with disability on this project, but there's plenty of us here and we got to figure out our own stuff first. So let's try to think about what's most important for telling this story in this moment. And again, the Playhouse was behind it 100% and did some wonderful things. The San Diego community was awesome because we started local, right? Reaching out to those individual people and saying, here's what our goal is. So
that's great. And congratulations. That's really a major thing. And it sounds like everybody will be different as a result because it just opened up new things. So can you tell a little bit more about kind of what that was like, and a little bit more about what everybody learned out of it that may have been unexpected, if you're at liberty to say?
Yeah, so it really, one of the things that drew me to Mickey as a co-collaborator and as a theater artist is he has this endless supply of hope that theater and the arts are really important. And one of the reasons that he believes that theater and the arts is really important is that representation is important and that theater has the opportunity to change everybody's perspective on representation and who has value in this society, right? And the example that he uses often is he says 99.9% of portrayals of autism show white men with Savant syndrome. He said, so if you are trying to do a production of The Curious Incident of the Dog in the Nighttime, of course you want to look for a performer who's on the autism spectrum, but what a gift it would be to the whole world, to cast a woman in that role, to cast a woman of color in that role, to cast a trans person in that role, because those people are autistic too. And doctors who make diagnoses see plays, and parents see plays, and teachers see plays. And so, theater and the arts have this amazing ability, this amazing potential to change the way that we see each other and that we represent each other. So the play that happened at the Playhouse is called Emily Driver's Great Race Through Time and Space. It's by A.A. Brenner and Greg Mazgala. And A.A. and Greg wrote this amazing young protagonist, Emily, who's 12. And her main goal for the 45 minutes of the play is to get a wheelchair. She really wants one. It will help her connect with her friends. It'll help her be less tired. It's what we called in our design meetings, it's wheelchair gain, right? The wheelchair is going to improve her quality of life. And so the play itself, actually bringing the play, because it's a tour, right? So we're going to different schools. The play itself actually included 3 wheelchairs. So we're loading and unloading from our truck all of these wheelchairs. 2 of them went together to make a vintage red Mustang, which was super cool in the play. But walking in to a school and having all of the kids, whether or not they had a disability or they didn't, see these wheelchairs as these cool things, right, that were part of this artistic experience. And then also to have the actual physical learning of each school to say, oh, we don't have a performance space that's accessible for 3 wheelchairs. What do we do? And the Playhouse was great about this. They did site visits in advance. They did a lot of advanced communications. They did all of those 3 C's that we talked about. But at the end of the day, sometimes we had to perform on the floor, right? In front of the stage instead of actually up on the auditorium stage. And there were at least 2 schools that I know of in the 6-week run of the show in San Diego, maybe more, but at least 2 that I know of, where because of our play, the principal made a call to the superintendent and the superintendent approved the funding to make their stage accessible.
Wow, that's awesome.
Yeah, so there's so many lessons and so many things that we learned from that process, and I could go on for ages. But I love the story that because of our play, because we wanted to tell a play that was about wheelchair gain, about disability gain, we had 2 schools that literally changed their physical layout to be more accessible for their students.
That just gives me chills. I think that's amazing. That's so good. Yes, progress.
And it was a whole team effort, right? That was the whole team. That was everybody at the Playhouse. That was the whole artistic team getting all of that feedback. and helping that happen, come all together. It's the principals that were brave enough to say this needs to change, right? Because there's that what you're talking about, that fear where it's like, oh no, we'll just figure this out. And I just love the idea of the two principals being like, nope, today's the day, it's gonna happen.
That's great. And of course, young people carry those messages loudly and strongly because especially, I mean, theater brings you into a world where you're experiencing people's stories and, you know, you forget they're actors. They're like, you're living that experience along with them. So I can only imagine the young people are also fired up like, hey, we got to change this, you know? So that's awesome. Endless supply of hope. That's it, our kids, right? Amazing. So we are also now in the times of social distancing. And how is that impacting interactions with the disability community, with the non-disabled community? How can we make our online sessions more accessible? I know you sent me an article, which is awesome, and I will definitely post in the show notes. But yeah, I mean, what's this all like?
Well, my first caveat is that I might not be the best person to answer that question because I have not been working full time since this all happened. I am home full time a lot of the time solo with my 3-year-old son, so I have on a good day maybe an hour or an hour and a half of non-toddler time. So I have not had the same steep learning curve about digital interactions and virtual interactions as many of my colleagues have, who are switching all of their interactions to be digital. But I can say that Mickey and I try to keep in touch with our advisory company members and just keep our fingers on the pulse of what's going on with the disability community. And we've seen a lot of responses, especially on social media. Some of them have been really excited and enthusiastic because the disability community has been using virtual interaction as an accessibility tool for years. You know, there are many people in the disability community where connecting with people outside of their house virtually is their primary form of communication and of socialization. So there's been a little bit of sly smiling and winking. You know, it's like, oh, the rest of the world's trying to kind of keep up with this, right? Or catch up with this. There's also so many different disability studies courses and events and activities where the curators of those classes, those events, have been making it accessible digitally for a long time. So there's a lot of resources out there in the disability community about how the rest of the world can make this shift, because we've been kind of playing with that and doing that in different degrees for a while. There's also, I gotta say, Marta, there's also a lot of anxiety and a lot of fear right now, because a lot of times when you think about accessibility, it feels like something that would be nice. It feels like something that is extra, you know, and one thing that we know in the disability rights community and in the disability justice community is that accessibility is not a privilege or something extra, it's a basic human right. And so we've got, with allocation of resources, with limited resources, there are a lot of people and a lot of advocates in our community that are really worried that people with disabilities are not going to get the basic human care that we deserve during this time. And that is really hard. It's hard to take in. It's hard to know what we can do to support them. But when I go to sleep at night, I think, oh my goodness, don't we need disabled arts even more, right? To share that humanity, to lift it up, to remind folks that aren't as familiar with disability culture that our lives matter. And I think one thing we're all learning in this time, right, is that who we are and what our productivity looks like in the world are two separate things, and that has got to be okay, right? Disability rights advocates have been preaching that for as long as I can remember, right? That we have to have a value for every individual life that's out there, and we can't, nothing about us without us. We can't put a value on somebody else's quote unquote quality of life unless we've had that conversation. So again, tough times, it hits me to the core, but I also feel like when we're ready, we're going to have some really amazing disabled art coming out of this time, which I'm looking forward to.
I think so too. And as I've been having these conversations with folks from the creative sector over 31 days now, it's been really uplifting to have these conversations. Almost every conversation that comes up, that we're here and recognizing that being is so important and being counts, not just productivity in the doing, but really seeing people's humanity and giving up personal conveniences on behalf of, you know, people you don't know. I think it's a really beautiful thing, and it gives me hope. I don't know, but it gives me endless hope. But I love that phrase from Nikki. But certainly we're going to get through this together, and we're going to get through it because we care about one another and we're willing to do whatever it takes to help each other. That's my personal understanding of it all, or my hope. So
it reminds me sometimes, people that aren't as familiar with disability, they'll often start the sentence with like, oh, I could never do that, right? Like it's hard for them to imagine what it would be like. And I've been thinking about that a lot in this time. It's like, we're learning that we all can do it, right? That it's not easy. It's not what we expected. There's a learning curve. There's a really steep learning curve. And there are some days where it's really hard, but we can do it, and we can all do it. And that we will come out of it.
I'm so glad you said that. That really resonates, and that's gonna sink in for the next couple of days. I'm really gonna digest that, because I think it's really beautiful. And thank you for contributing that. That's really, really great. Talleri, I could speak to you all day long. You are amazing, and it's such a pleasure to speak with you, to learn from you, and to have this platform to share this conversation and all of your expertise and best practices, but also just like to share the beauty of who you are and what you're up to. So thank you for joining me, and everybody, stay creative.
Thank you so much.